Hello, everybody, and welcome to Psyched Out, a podcast focused on all things psychology, like psychological thrillers, unethical experiments, true crime, cults, and more. I am your host, Emily, and for those who don't know, I have a bachelor's degree in forensic psychology and a background in law enforcement. This helps me provide unique insight on some of the world's most famous cases, movies, and events. In today's episode, we'll be talking about cannibalism. You may be wondering how I decided on this topic, and it's because of the Epstein files. I know, everything seems to tie back into there, but I have people in my comments section insisting that there's an entire cannibalistic society involving the elite, and I fundamentally disagree for a lot of reasons, and I think this belief in the conspiracy comes from an uneducated standpoint. So I decided to delve deeper into cannibalism. Now, I already had a decent understanding about the pathology and psychology of cannibalism due to my degree, but it doesn't hurt to investigate things further and see what sort of research has come out since I've originally studied it. What my goal is for this episode is to show the realities of cannibalism, which are not at all what Hollywood shows, and what people believe is happening in the Epstein files. So I'll be showing clips of Hollywood's portrayal of cannibals towards the end. I can't show too many clips because a lot of it is just gore and it's just grotesque. And then I'm going to be discussing why those depictions are flawed and why it influences the average person's perception of what cannibalism is. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in. As many of you know, cannibalism has been around for centuries. As grotesque as it is, it's been a part of human evolution and multiple societies for, hundreds of years. However, cannibalism historically has been used for very specific reasons and is different from the pathological criminal cannibal. Historical cannibalism stems from religious practices where consuming other humans could give a warrior the strength of their enemy or even wisdom. It could also be used to ward off bad omens, or in some cases be seen as a sign of respect. Some tribes would actually consume the deceased body of a loved one after they've passed. Again, that was seen as a sign of respect. In other instances, cannibalism is documented as a result of famine, where consuming deceased persons is a means of survival. These methods are distinguishable from the criminal cannibal. Simply put, the criminal cannibal has a different motive and overall a different pathology. Their behavior stems from many different factors outside of religious purposes or survival. In fact, their behavior stems primarily from desire, pleasure, and compulsion. In short, non-criminal cannibalism can be explained by a series of categories and circumstances such as survival, cultural customs, aggression in warfare, medical purposes such as, if you consume a specific body part, it can cure some specific disease, as well as sacrifices to gods. Now, based on what people have described in the Epstein files, this is not the type of cannibalism they're referring to, which is why I'm focusing on criminal cannibalism. Now, criminal cannibalism has posed a unique problem for a very long time in the scientific world, which is that it is so rare that getting appropriate sample sizes for studies has been nearly impossible. It is very, very difficult. In fact, research suggests that serial killers find cannibalism repulsive and even more evil than their own acts, even though they themselves could be doing some of the most grotesque things imaginable, especially sexual sadists. So, what differentiates a cannibal from a serial killer? In theory, you could probably guess that there's quite a bit of crossover, and that crossover would be extensive, but it actually isn't. So how is it that a serial killer can murder countless people, even dismember them, but then refrain from consuming them? Because at a base level, humans, biologically and psychologically, were not designed to be cannibals for criminal purposes. The human body can become very, very sick when eating human flesh. We don't, in modern society, have the appropriate enzymes in our stomach to break down that type of material as efficiently as, we would like if we wanted to be a cannibal. Some of you may have heard of Kuru, a fatal disease that was spread throughout Papua New Guinea when mothers and children ate the diseased brains of dead relatives as a sign of respect. Again, that's more ritualized cannibalism, not criminal cannibalism. But this disease is fatal, and it has a very long incubation period, which makes it difficult to detect at times. And on top of that, there's blood diseases, skin diseases, and additional maladies that are easily spread through cannibalism. So, if you did eat somebody, it would probably give you a really big tummy ache. In theory, you could eat somebody. It's likely not going to kill you if you pick the right person. Again, that's if you pick the right person, but it would be kind of a long, difficult, and very dangerous process to do, and the digestion alone would be not that great. Now, as for why people's psyche prevents them from devouring others, it has to do with a combination of morals, social acceptance, disgust, and purpose, as well as desire. At the bare bones of it all, people really just don't want to eat each other. It's counterintuitive. It doesn't lend to any real benefits unless, of course, you're in a famine or you're in a survival situation. And even then, those who've resorted to cannibalism for survival have done so as an absolute last resort, and it's a great moral conflict for them. So, what makes a cannibal? And honestly, that's a difficult question to answer because study sizes are so small. But I did do some digging, and research suggests a few different possibilities. In one part of a study, researchers determined that there are two primary patterns among cannibalistic offenders. One group is basically psychosis driven, disorganized, and aggressive in their behavior. And those who were more sadist in nature, driven by a sadistic nature, were more organized and offensive in their behavior. So those are the two groups. You have the psychosis driven and you have the sadists of cannibalism. Now, those driven by psychosis experience cannibalistic urges due to either like drug induced psychosis, schizophrenia, or a combination of mental illnesses and personality disorders. And their cannibalistic acts were performed in defense to a perceived attack or slight, something that felt endangering and damaging to their person, their livelihood, and their survival. Whereas those who committed criminal cannibalism for sadistic purposes did so offensively. They did it because they wanted to, and it wasn't retaliatory in nature, but rather an active pursuit, which is why their behavior is often organized compared to the erratic, disorganized behavior of those in psychosis. Furthermore, another set of study authors devised that cannibalism patients kind of fall into two groups. They actually divided cannibal patients into two groups: those with severe schizophrenia and those suffering from mixed personality disorders. Specifically, those with, quote, sadistic and psychopathic features associated with paraphilia. In either group, all patients had dysfunctional childhoods, so that's something that's going to be blanket across the board in this study. And unfortunately, these childhoods expose them to sexual abuse, violence at home, or just straight up emotional neglect. And for those who don't know, cannibalism often has sexual undertones when done criminally, and in many instances, so does serial killing. Now, cannibals in many cases are also serial killers, unless they're like door dashing dead bodies, which apparently is possible through some really weird dark web websites. I don't know if any of you guys have seen the documentary on the zombie and meat trade. Very interesting documentary. Very scary. That's a topic for another episode, but basically, there's like a really difficult way of separating cannibals out of the serial killer group because they kind of have to be serial killers to get people to eat. So it goes hand in hand. But one thing that I learned in school is that serial killers often engage in sexual activity at a very young age, and this is sometimes due to sexual abuse, where they then explore dark and sadistic fantasies before eventually engaging in real-life predatory behavior to assist in those fantasies. Basically, the fantasies get to a point where it's not sexually gratifying to them anymore, and then they initiate those fantasies on the real world. So, cannibals experiencing sexual abuse in childhood will lend to the typical pathology of a serial killer, as well as a cannibal fueled by sexual desire. Now, two patients in the mixed personality disorder group were reportedly unconcerned about social taboos, social requirements, where it's like, hey, don't go and eat people. One thing we have to remember is that one of the big reasons people don't resort to cannibalism, like I said, is because socially it's unacceptable, but these individuals didn't care. In this instance, the two patients admitted to cannibalistic fantasies or plans, quote, going back many years, end quote. The researchers ultimately questioned why they would want to attack and eat their victims, and the patients responded to the question, and it was basically concluded that, quote, feelings of humiliation seemed to be the trigger, and both patients assaulted their victims at a time when they suffered a loss of self-esteem, end quote. The cannibalism was also accompanied by sexual acts involving the victims. Again, not uncommon given the sexual abuse and the pathology behind a lot of serial killers, specifically sexual sadists, and there's a lot of overlap between what we're talking about between cannibals, sexual sadists, and serial killers. They're basically just all part of a bigger pie chart. So it can get a little confusing, but just know that it's all very much interconnected, and this issue of low self-esteem and rejection is going to be important, and we're going to discuss it later. In contrast, in the same study, cannibalism in the 3 patients who suffered from schizophrenia came from an outburst of sudden violence, something that was overwhelming to them. And all 3 of the patients attacked and ate parts of their parents, which is really sad when you think about it. But again, that'll come into play a little bit later, so hold on to that info. But the researchers discovered that there was a history of emotional friction and hostility in these parent-child relationships. It's not too surprising when we will eventually examine other evidence as to why that might be the case with those 3 individuals. But overall, the study concluded that the schizophrenia group performed cannibalism as a very extreme reaction in a form of self-defense, specifically self-defense to a threat of destruction, whether that was perceived physically or psychologically. So it was something that they felt and believed was detrimental to their well-being, and it was overall insurmountable, which led to the outburst. Now, for the patients with mixed personality disorder, cannibalism ultimately boosted their self-esteem and just relieved tension, likely satiating the need that they had from their very dark and disturbing fantasies. These individuals actively engaged in the behavior to make themselves feel better, and the studies quoted as saying ego and narcissism are the central issue, with a desire to overcome deep-rooted frustrations by means of an extraordinary act, end quote. Now, what did I mean when I asked you guys to take note of the schizophrenic cannibals attacking their parents and all of this self-esteem issue? Well, for one thing, cannibals like to seek out familiar individuals or complete strangers. It kind of depends. Many cases, cannibals will eat a relative, a friend, a parent, somebody that's, easy access, because it doesn't require as much work. Obviously, this isn't always the case. I mean, if we look at Dahmer and everything, that wasn't necessarily the case with him, but it does happen a lot where it is a familiar individual that is unfortunately victimized. And what makes this important is that literature shows most cannibals are often unmarried and lonely, like very, very lonely, very, very bitter about being lonely. And interestingly enough, many of them have an extensive history of family suicides, psychiatric illnesses, or a childhood of sexual abuse or other types of abuse. So essentially, cannibals exist within the fringes of society. They're loners. They're oftentimes unwanted by their own family. They are used and then discarded. And this leads to a lot of bitterness and anger and low self-esteem. And a lot of times it kind of transitions into sexual frustration because of that loneliness. And as mentioned earlier, sexual abuse can lead to severe sexual deviancy as well as a lack of social contact. And a lack of social contact can cause dark fantasies to not only manifest but worsen with time. So it's kind of this weird, never-ending cycle. Studies have also focused on the history of cannibals, hinting at a context of abuse and violence, usually in relation to a maternal figure, which again is important. Now, American sociologist Catherine Martinez describes violent cannibalism as a form of, quote, gendered consumption, end quote, where the perpetrators and consumers were primarily men, while the victims were often women and children, or, quote, feminized men, which was kind of in Dahmer's case. And many serial killers are men. Statistically, that's just kind of how it is. And they tend to be much more violent. Again, overlap between serial killers and cannibals. Now, women, and this is something that I found absolutely fascinating throughout college, they tend to fall into a category known as comfort-oriented killing. They kill to gain financially or socially. It's not to alleviate sexual desires. It's not to be sadistic. It's not to just be violent. They have this end goal that's supposed to elevate them in some type of tangible physical way. It's kind of where we get the whole Black Widow type of killer, where this lady's killed 3 of her husbands to get their life insurance money. And this is why women often resort to things like poisoning or other more passive methods of killing. In contrast, their male counterparts, male serial killers specifically, harbor a lot of resentment for women, and a lot of times this stems from childhoods of domineering mothers and submissive fathers, or outright absent fathers. And in other cases, they hate women because their own mothers are more promiscuous. This is something that we see a lot when it's serial killers who come from low income situations. Their mom was maybe, an alcoholic who slept around a lot. This harbors a big amount of resentment in them, and then they take that and they internalize it, and then they grow up with it, and it leads to violent and sexual fantasies. Overall, male perpetrators have a desire to be dominant and in control, and this is seen in both serial killers as well as criminal cannibals. And it's a very scary trend when you really think about it, and the frequency of this theme, interestingly enough, has led to something known as cannibal films, which are a notable subgenre of horror films, which usually star men as the violent killers. Now, another reason cannibals are lonely is because of their cannibalism. They can't exactly surround themselves with friends and family if they have some guy shoved into their freezer. The act in and of itself feeds into an isolated lifestyle. It's sort of this never-ending cycle mixed with a self-fulfilling prophecy. But if the human body sucks at digesting human flesh, and it's dangerous to do so because we are riddled with disease, why the hell would anybody continue to do the behavior after trying it? And that is a fantastic question. I'm glad you asked. So, cannibalism can actually become an addiction. Cannibals who spend months, even years, creating these violent fantasies get addicted to the idea, and then when they actually act out that fantasy for the first time, the dopamine rush is insane. It's like somebody experiencing meth or fentanyl for the first time, and they therefore seek out that rush and fulfillment of fantasy from there on out. Again, a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, Kieran Hyland, a sociologist, discussed that unlike other addictions, the chances of the average person becoming addicted to cannibalism are exceptionally low, and that, quote, it takes a complete lack of empathy and ability to experience normal human emotions to reach this state. Generally, less than 1% of the population is classified as a psychopath, although more may possess the tendencies associated with psychopathic behaviors, end quote. Karen goes on to mention that most cannibals are not psychotic. Like I said earlier, there's sort of the two groups, ones that are more sadistic and others who end up being cannibals due to mental illness and psychosis. So she's reaffirming that. And so most cannibals are not psychotic, but they do have a lot of psychopathic tendencies, and honestly, a very, very small percentage of psychopaths would ever even consider the idea of cannibalism, including serial killers. Additionally, in classic psychoanalytical theory, cannibalistic impulses are often associated with fixation at the oral biting phase of psychosexual development, which is why we see people like Ted Bundy who bit their victims. And while he didn't engage in full-blown cannibalism, he still had a biting fixation, which is also part of cannibalistic behaviors. He just didn't cross over that line, but he also had a plethora of other issues, so, realistically, who knows? Now, it should be noted that part of the reason cannibals engage in the behavior they do is because of their loneliness. Dahmer, for instance, stated that his cannibalism was a, quote, perverse sexual practice or paraphilia, and that the eating of a victim was associated with a, quote, feeling of making him part of me. Many cannibals actually take great care to prepare their victims. They see it as a sign of respect, and it allows them to spend more time with the victim. This helps nullify and negate the loneliness that is so deeply embedded in their lives. As you guys know, Dahmer was a very socially awkward individual, very isolated. He didn't know how to interact with people in a way that didn't scare the shit out of them. So he satiated that loneliness through cannibalism, as well as, sexual acts with cannibalism and different things like that. But again, if you're taking the time to prepare a victim, cook them, as weird as that is to say, the way that you want, you get to spend more time with them. And sometimes these individuals have like full blown conversations with the people that they're eating, even though that person is dead. On top of this, the driving force underlying sexual cannibalism within criminal cannibals stems from sadomasochism, specifically embedded in a dominance and submission arrangement. Being lonely all the time obviously isn't good for the human psyche. This is why people tend to have a problem with, like, solo confinement in jails and prisons for extended periods of time, because the human brain craves social interaction. We are social creatures, we are designed for that. So taking that away from somebody really isn't a good idea. But like I said, cannibals, known loners, do not socially interact with people like at all. And then on top of that, they typically have very terrible childhoods, and they lack an overall sense of control. They lack control over themselves as well, which doesn't help because they have their perpetual fantasies, the biting compulsion, the sexual desires that they can't seem to satiate. Killing and eating somebody basically is the easiest way to have them exercise eternal power over the victim. On top of this, many cannibals have been diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, which really isn't that surprising, meaning that even if they had the opportunity to, properly integrate into society, they would likely choose not to because they don't really know how to, and also they're antisocial. They don't want to be part of that. Their belief system and their actions do not fit within societal requirements, which again reinforces the idea that they don't belong. So, once again, they exist on the fringes, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, something that I found to be particularly interesting was a study that examined the differences between serial killers and cannibals and kind of what distinguished them from one another. This paper about this study incorporated some other studies as well that seemed to substantiate these results. So findings in one of the studies showed that cannibalistic serial killers displayed distinct patterns compared to their serial killer counterparts. They showed signs of being more organized and driven by sadism, while serial killers who didn't cannibalize their victims were driven by the goal of disposing evidence. So they may have actively dismembered their victims the way that cannibals would, but they weren't intent on eating anybody, they just wanted to get rid of the evidence. So they weren't exactly like eating people in that regard. Even sexual sadists tend to dump their victims quickly, engaging in the murder and sex crime as fast as possible before moving on, because also they don't want to get caught. In a study done by Whittam and Wilson, they learned that experiences of physical abuse were increased in the cannibalistic sample of their study. Additionally, there appeared to be an increase in biological abnormalities in the cannibal sample compared to non-cannibals. For example, brain abnormalities, head trauma, and other neurological conditions. Another study found that cannibalistic serial killers showed evidence of psychiatric problems throughout their lifetimes, such as personality disorders, schizophrenia, and other neurological conditions. In some instances, it was found that there was an increased prevalence of biological abnormalities in paraphilic serial killers who engaged in cannibalism of their victims compared to those who did not cannibalize their victims. The study also indicated that cannibals often come from lower social economic upbringings, meaning that wealthier killers were less likely to engage in cannibalistic behaviors upon killing, which kind of makes a lot of sense because cannibalism does stem significantly from a sense of dominance and control, and upper class killers have lived a life where they've already had more control than their lower class counterparts and have been more dominant than their lower class counterparts. And the last thing I want to discuss ties back into the presence of loneliness. There's a theory that's quite prominent in psychology as well as sociology, known as Hershey's social bond theory. And, the theory states that humans are naturally drawn to deviant behavior, and social bonds constructed throughout their lives steer them away from committing crimes and this deviant behavior. this is true to a certain extent because we grow up learning right and wrong based on our parents and other adults, whether that's like a teacher or your best friend's mom or something of the sort. These are social bonds, and they're key in developing healthy human beings. Social bonds, simply put, create social norms, and over time, people grow to feel a certain obligation to follow those social norms. And it's sort of it's like a social version of morality. In contrast, if somebody is unable to create meaningful social bonds, the theory suggests that the lack of bonds leaves one, quote, free to deviate, end quote. So if you grow up lonely, abused, etc., you're more inclined to push back against societal expectations. This is somewhat argumentative in nature, but the same can be said about meaningful social bonds because kids born into a family of criminals are more likely to accept criminal behavior because it's what's modeled to them. So it kind of goes both ways, but I do think the social bond theory has a point. And collectively, based on the research and my education, I am inclined to say that what I've learned here and kind of what I've already known lends to the belief that the cannibalism, I say in air quotes, in the Epstein files is unlikely, if not entirely false. Do I think it's maybe possible there's a cannibal in the elite society, like the upper 1%? Yeah, sure. But the cannibal theory suggests that Epstein and other elite members of society are engaging in criminal cannibalism when in reality they have no reason to do so. Not only does it not make sense statistically, but these are people who aren't lonely, as far as we know, weren't abused, and are not isolated individuals. They don't come from low economic status. They don't lack social bonds. And while this elite society of pedophiles engaged in organized crime, it isn't organized cannibalism, which hasn't been documented outside of religious purposes. And as far as I know, there's no modern religion that calls for sacrifice. Now, some people may argue, oh, well, they're doing it for religious purposes. And I push back on that because cannibalism done for religious purposes is not a secret. It's not hidden. People know about it. And these people who do it as religious practice are not seeking to be isolated from that act. They're not having to hide what they're doing because for them, it's not criminal. It's not something to be ashamed of. On top of that, somebody sent me a document that was basically like, oh yeah, George W. Bush consumed the intestines of a baby on a yacht surrounded by other people, which does not even remotely fit the pathology of a cannibal. Nobody is eating an entire human being, let alone a baby and its intestines, in front of other individuals. It doesn't make sense. So why is this narrative taking off? And to be honest, I blame Hollywood, because Hollywood has depicted cannibalism as this fantastical, gory phenomenon, when in reality it isn't. It's not Hannibal Lecter like lunging to bite the ear off of a nurse because he's hungry. It's not how it works. Does it make for great entertainment? Yeah, sure it does, but it's not at all what cannibalism actually is. So we're going to go ahead and show a few clips. They're a little bit gory, but I think it serves a point. So let me pull those up. So this first clip is going to be from a film called Cannibal Cabin. So we're going to watch this really quick. Hopefully you can hear it okay. So for podcast purposes, there's a pregnant lady tied down, and individuals are surrounding her wearing skin masks of other people that have presumably been cannibalized. They are sharpening knives and eating her intestines. Now, I'm not going to show the rest of that just because YouTube's going to get mad at me, but I think my point stands. This doesn't make any sense at all. They're not going to keep the victim alive. They're not going to just eat their freaking intestines, and they're not going to wear skin masks. So again, the glorification of cannibalism, making it worse than it actually is partially why we have narratives where, George W. Bush is eating the intestines of a baby on a yacht. But this isn't the only one. Let's look at something called Cannibal Holocaust. Now, Cannibal Holocaust is a movie rooted in deep racism, so this is also great. So that clip, not only are cannibal movies typically stemmed in racism when it focuses on like ritualistic cannibalism, which is a problem in and of itself, Cannibal Holocaust follows reportedly true events of journalists who went to a tribe and then were consequently cannibalized, and it was a whole thing. But again, the fact that they're going to brutally like assassinate a bunch of people and then just start devouring their flesh instantly, it doesn't make sense. That's not how cannibalism is. That's not how cannibalism works. But again, Hollywood is glorifying this entire process, making it as scary as possible because it provides entertainment value. Last clip. Hannibal Lecter. You guys know. I've watched these.
Can I have some?
You're a very unusual boy, aren't you?
I couldn't eat what they gave me.
Now should you? It isn't even food as I understand the definition, which is why I always bring my own. So, which would you like to try? Ah. Well, I suppose it's all right. After all, as your mother tells you, my mother certainly told me, it is important, she always used to say, always to try new things. Open up.
So that's the ending scene of the second movie, which I did do a podcast episode on, where Hannibal Lecter feeds a piece of brain to a child on the plane. Now, obviously, we talked about Kuru and how that's bad, and eating the brain of somebody, which is where Kuru stems from, is probably not the best idea. But also, cannibals aren't going to just have brain on a platter on a flight. That's dumb. People know what a brain looks like, even if it's cooked. I don't think you could pass that off very well. Again, this is for entertainment purposes, and it's supposed to be psychologically disturbing. Now, I will say Hannibal Lecter is probably one of the better portrayals of a cannibal because he does prepare the food. I say food as if I'm not talking about a human being. That's really weird. He does take time to prepare the victims and things like that. But again, there's also an element of gore and exaggeration and fabrication to make it more shocking to an audience. Movies like this are directly responsible for why people think cannibalism is different than it actually is. It is not this big grand spectacle that is meant for everybody in the universe to see. Cannibals don't want people to know they're committing acts of cannibalism. Cannibals don't carry pieces of human beings with them onto airplanes to eat and feed to other children. Their pathology is entirely isolated. So when people are going to show me apparent evidence that cannibalism is taking place in the Epstein files and is George Bush eating a baby on a yacht in front of a bunch of other people, it doesn't make sense. And this whole issue stems from people who, in my opinion, cannot accept the fact that the Epstein files are specifically related to child sex trafficking, sexual abuse, and raping children, which is bad enough as it is. People want it to be something worse, more grotesque, more fantastical. And I don't think that's fair, and I don't think that's appropriate. And part of that is because of the Hollywood narrative. And it's bothersome. I don't think I will be able to change a conspiracy theorist's mind. Sometimes they're going to believe what they want to believe. But I hope a rational individual who is watching this and listening to this goes, you know what? Maybe she's onto something. Again, is it possible that there's at least one cannibal in the elite society? Yeah, sure. But I don't think it's what people are making it out to be. Because cannibalism overall is a very unfathomable thing. And there's a reason it's such an unfathomable thing. Because in reality, cannibalism is rare. It's a fraction of the 1%. And people tend to think that it's statistically more significant than it actually is, to the point where media will often report on instances claiming cannibalism happened when in fact it didn't, because it's clickbaity and it draws a lot of attention and people get excited about it, which I think is partially why people keep saying, oh, there's cannibalism in the Epstein files. It's because it gives them views, it gives them clicks. And I think it's disingenuous, and frankly it pisses me off because it's detracting from the actual crimes that were done to these victims and twisting it into the satanic panic narrative. And I don't like it, and I don't agree with it. Cannibalism is not spewing blood out of arteries and wearing somebody's face while you carve the intestines out of a pregnant lady. That's not what cannibalism is. It is a complex and nuanced phenomenon that overall exists more in nightmare than it does in reality. So, hopefully, I have educated you guys a little bit. I will include my sources in the video notes in the description. Please, just all I ask is that we acknowledge facts and evidence. And again, there's not a whole lot of it because cannibalism is so rare. But if you look at research material that discusses cannibalism, you will see that it is not what people are making it out to be. It's not. It's very, very different than the way Hollywood portrays it and the way that people portray it because they're used to the Hollywood version. So don't glorify things that don't need to be glorified, basically, is the takeaway. I don't have much else for you guys. Again, still looking into the Epstein files. Doing all that jazz. The new podcast room is underway. I will post an update of that. I got all my bookshelves put together and all of my fun little collectibles and trinkets put up. So eventually I will be transitioning into a different environment than this little thing for future videos. If you want to support me and help make that happen, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Make sure you share. Tell all your friends about this. And as always, guys, please stay safe out there. Please take care of each other and stay psyched out.